Hi, I'm Benjamin Ashwell from the podcast Talking History, the Italian Unification, which I host with my brother. I'm thrilled to be introducing the podcast History of Our World by Rob Monaco. This show is a rare combination of outstanding storytelling, humor, and historical research. Combine that with a show that promises to cover the history of the world, and you've got something unique. If you're not already hooked on the show, you soon will be.
Welcome back to the podcast History of Our World. Chapter 44. The Death of Socrates. Who is Socrates? He's a philosopher, sure, and maybe you saw him in that one movie where two kids from San Dimas, California connect with him over hair metal lyrics. Maybe you know him as that Greek Santa Claus-looking guy in a toga who drank poison. But how much do you know the real Socrates? Well, don't feel bad if you don't, because no one knows the real Socrates. At least no one's 100% sure they do. He was probably born in 470 and began his career as a stonecutter, just like his dad. At some point, he definitely studied philosophy from a student of one of the earliest Greek philosophers, and he gave up on the family business. As a budding young philosopher, he distinguished himself early on with his unusual methods of learning. Instead of gathering at the traditional places with the traditional people to talk about traditional topics, i.e. the old boys clubs, Socrates would go to public markets and converse with everyone: slaves, free men, wealthy politicians, artisans, the poor, and especially women. All women, sisters, mothers, priestesses, midwives, courtesans, anyone who could speak and think was a source of wisdom. And to get to this knowledge, Socrates employed a method that is now cleverly called the Socratic method. Essentially, it's getting someone to understand the faults in their argument by responding to their statements through constant questioning. Socrates' favorite responses would start with, "What do you mean by?" or "What is so-and-so?" And he quickly became famous for his ability to get anyone to contradict their own views. A feat that endeared him to the youth of Athens, who quickly annoyed their parents and elders with this technique. Young people also loved him because he worked for free, thus acquiring a mighty following of moochers. Of course, this earned him the ire of many in the for-profit business of education, and he became a topic of mockery amongst academic circles. As one comedian of the day, Epilogue, remarked, "I hate Socrates too, that prattling panhandler who figured out everything, except where he can get something to eat." They were also highly suspect of another interesting aspect of his life, an internal voice he called his daemonion. Think of it as a Jiminy Cricket that only he can see and talk to. Yeah, well, this voice sort of regulated his behavior in telling him only what was wrong, never what was right. Good, you say, a conscience is important. But when you openly converse with and acknowledge that your conscience is possibly something divine, well, that's when you start skirting blasphemy laws. But more on that later. Anyway, Socrates' status in Athens was firmly immortalized when one of his students, so enamored with his teacher, went to the Oracle of Delphi to ask her, "Is any man wiser than Socrates?" To which she replied in one of her famous drawn-out ambiguous riddles, "No." Well, that kind of takes care of that, right? But this answer really got under his skin. Socrates was aware that all he could do was just ruin arguments. He never actually had any of the answers, and so was fairly convinced he knew nothing. The only way to test this was to seek out the wisest people in the city and put them through a mental gauntlet. When he inevitably got them to contradict their own arguments, he turned to the poets and playwrights, who also failed, and then the craftsmen, hoping their focused skill sets would prove more enlightening. No such luck there. But after contradicting and annoying all these people, Socrates finally concluded that no one really knew anything. And since he knew this fact, and that logically he also knows nothing, he knows more than anyone, right? Sure, whatever. Oh, one more thing about Socrates: politics. He found flaws in all government styles, but especially went after democracy is just about the worst way to run a country. He argued that the average person isn't exactly the most intelligent or thoughtful, right? And now you're going to give that person a say in what the government should do? With possible life and death consequences? That's a terrible idea. And these opinions earned him quite a lot of admirers from the sons of the Athenian aristocracy. They were wealthy, and they were bored. Without a war to fight in, they formed secret drinking clubs sympathetic to Sparta and oligarchy in general. Socrates became a natural guru to them, especially since he was so close with their popular and charismatic leader, Alcibiades. Born in 452 to a very wealthy and powerful family, his father died when Alcibiades was young, and the boy became a ward of Pericles. He no doubt learned much from his new uncle, but also utilized what he learned from Socrates against the famous orator. A conversation between the two is passed down by the writer Xenophon, and you can either head over to the podcast's Facebook page for a copy, or look it up for yourself. It's pretty great. So as a young man, Alcibiades had it all. Athletic prowess, good looks, a sharp mind, and legions of suitors spoiling him rotten with all sorts of gifts. Sure, he was married, but this is ancient Greece after all. Men of rank were desperate for his love and attention. They even found Alcibiades' prominent lisp desirable. Even Socrates professed his love for him, but that's where the philosopher's affection ended. He was in love, true, but he was considerably more worried about the boy's moral compass. Socrates had already saved his life during the Peloponnesian War. Now he was trying to save his mind and soul. The boy had a sharp mind, and he admired and respected Socrates, but the hedonist lifestyle was very compelling. All the attention and pleasure-seeking just came naturally. The guy was so committed to it that his personal shield was Cupid, or Eros to the Greeks, holding a lightning bolt. I'm sure it was very threatening in battle. Socrates saw so much promise in the boy that he kept his relationship with him strictly platonic. Which is funny because Plato hadn't been born yet, and, well, I thought it was funny. Whatever, let's put Socrates on hold for a bit and talk more about Alcibiades, who was pretty angry about the whole peace thing between Athens and Sparta. Despite his rise in political power, he had been shut out of negotiations between the two states because of his youth. A pretty face will only get you so far, you know, but he wasn't going to take this affront sitting down. In 416, while the two cities were at a temporary truce, Alcibiades had a hand in convincing Athens to send a fleet with 3,000 soldiers to the tiny island of Melos. Though the Melians were of Spartan descent, the island remained neutral during the wars, although they ignored the memo that all the islands of the Aegean were in Athens' sphere of influence. As punishment for their neutrality, they should submit and pay tribute. Thucydides reports a dialogue, mostly fabricated, that took place between envoys from the two cities, basically saying that Melos is no threat to Athens and why can't we be friends? And Athens saying if they were a true friend, then they should just submit and be done with. The dialogue ends like this. The Melians. We will not in a moment deprive of freedom a city that has been inhabited these 700 years. We put our trust in the fortune by which the gods have preserved it until now, and in the help of men, that is, of the Spartans, and so we will try and save ourselves. Meanwhile, we invite you to allow us to be friends to you, and foes to neither party, and to retire from our country after making such a treaty as shall seem fit to both of us. The Athenians. Well, you alone, as it seems to us, regard what is future as more certain than what is before your eyes, and what is out of sight as already coming to pass. As you have staked most on, and trusted most in the Spartans, your fortune and your hopes, will you be most completely deceived. The island is inevitably conquered, plundered, and then the standard atrocity takes place. All grown men are slaughtered, and the women and children sold as slaves. Another black mark for Athens, and one which Alcibiades didn't really care about. He had become one of the 10 generals of Athens in that time, and already had a new idea for the city during this supposed time of peace, the conquest of Sicily. In 415, Alcibiades proposed adding the island to the empire, and what a jewel it would be. With its agricultural and mineral wealth under Athenian control, the city could dominate the Mediterranean. Of course, they'd have to get through Syracuse, the most powerful city on the island, but that shouldn't be too hard. Never mind that the city almost single-handedly held back the Carthaginian Empire. That was so long ago, who cares? He made his case before a sea of love-struck politicians who voted to grant him 200 triremes and a massive army to invade the island. Who's the little boy now, huh? Except amidst the sea of lecherous coots was a very dissatisfied anti-war faction in Athens, made up of younger conservatives worried about the financial drain, and older veterans who had seen the horrors of war. One morning, before the triremes had departed from Athens, the city awoke to an image of obscene sacrilege. Some person or persons had vandalized and disfigured every Herm in town. A herm, or herma, is a small pedestal with the head of Hermes, messenger of the gods, on the top, and a big old phallus on the front. Yep, ancient Greece. They're everywhere in Athens, guarding public squares, temples, homes, bringing luck and protection to all. And now a whole bunch of them had their faces smashed off, and their phalluses defallused? Unphallused? And that was bad, really bad. In addition to desecrating religious property, the older politicians immediately made the conclusion that oligarchic factions were trying to sabotage the invasion. That had to be it. But who would do such a thing? The first person accused was Alcibiades. Pretty rich boy like him, of course he'd want to do it. Yeah, but why? Why delay his own invasion plans? What benefit would come from it? Alcibiades immediately demands a trial so he could deny these gross accusations, but the assembly, perhaps realizing their case was thin, allows him to make ready for Sicily in the meantime, and they'll call him back when they're ready. The expedition, as it was called, reached Sicily towards the end of 415, but no sooner had they landed than a ship from Athens arrived for Alcibiades. He had been formally charged with desecrating the Herms, in addition to making a mockery of another religious ceremony. He denies the charges, but requests he take his own ship back to Athens, as befits a man of his status. The envoys agree and lead him back home. Yeah, except you never see an episode of Cops where they arrest a guy and then let him drive to the police station on his own. Of course he's going to run away. When the moment was right, Alcibiades veers off and heads to Sparta, a city where someone like him could feel quite welcome. Now you might be thinking, why? Why, if he was innocent, did he run? Well, he was mostly worried about getting a fair trial. Did he break the statues? Definitely not. Did he mock the religious ceremony? Well, he did have a habit of getting really drunk and doing stupid things. So off to Sparta he goes. While there, he ingratiates himself to the Spartan leadership by revealing Athenian plans for Sicily, exaggerating his tale by mentioning how Athens would next go after Italy, and even Carthage. The Spartans, needless to say, were concerned. With detailed information about troops and strategy from Alcibiades, the Spartans agree to make ready for war. Again, so much for the peace. They send out their army to support the Syracusans, and after a few battles, including numerous wall-building contests, the Athenian army is defeated. But that's only the beginning. The trireme fleet is destroyed, the Athenian generals executed. 7,000 prisoners were left, a small army on their own, but completely without leadership or supplies. The Spartans put them to work in the stone quarries near Syracuse, selling some into slavery, but mostly standing by while the rest die of starvation or disease. 7,000. Only a handful are allowed to return to Athens with news of this catastrophe. So now in the year 413, Athens was in a really bad way. The loss of the fleet and all those men had a debilitating effect on the Athenian psyche. The ships could be replaced, true, but those men couldn't. Even if we separate the emotions from it, it would take a few years to train skilled trireme rowers. In the meantime, Athens would have to make do with newbies. Also of concern was the once overflowing coffers had been thoroughly drained to pay for the constant warfare. Tribute-paying allies, who might have at one time been afraid to revolt, did so openly, and the silver mines where Athens acquired much of her wealth were devoid of workers. The 20,000 slaves needed for the work had fled for Sparta. Shows you how horrible it was to work in a mine those days. Athens was forced to melt works of art for money and debase their gold coins with copper. And yet in spite of the hardships, the city kept going, believing deep down that victory could still be achieved. There was a brief moment of relief when someone finally confessed to mutilating the Herm statues. He revealed that it was part of a plot by members of the secret drinking clubs I mentioned earlier, the ones with Spartan leanings. Yeah, that's not good. Many of these members are rounded up and put to death, while the others fled, only to gather their forces and successfully stage a coup in 411. The Athenian democracy was replaced with an oligarchy, just as Alcibiades had always wanted, and oh look, he's invited back to join in the new government. Good timing too. He had gotten a little too close with the wife of one of the Spartan kings, and it wasn't safe for him to stay there anymore. In power now as strategos, Alcibiades actually gets a chance to lead the Athenians to a few victories over the Spartans, who by now are actually working with the Persians to end this war. Oh yes, the superpower has finally become involved again with the Greek states. Alcibiades' triumphant return wouldn't last long, because after a series of defeats in the Aegean, his political enemies conspire to remove his authority. The stakes were just too high to permit that many failures. Alcibiades exiles himself to a town near the Hellespont, where in 405 he bears witness to Athens' final note. The war had been raging on for close to 3 decades now, and Sparta had gained the upper hand. Athens was broke and exhausted, but pride would not permit surrender. Plus, they still had a fleet of about 171 ships, the strongest of any city. They once beat the Persian Empire with similar numbers, and they could do it again. Yeah, but except this time there were few veterans and even fewer competent generals. Case in point, the beach at Aegas Potami, near the Hellespont where the fleet had docked. Alcibiades had warned the general there that the ships need to be ready to move and not waiting on land, and for his warning he was told to leave and never come back. But he was right. Sparta had sent their own ships in the middle of the night and caught the Athenians in an incompetent blunder. All the triremes were captured and 4,000 prisoners were executed. That was that. Without a fleet, Athens could not import food or protect the port of Piraeus, which the Spartans proceeded to blockade. The city of Athens, which had withstood the Dorian invasion, which had fought off the Persians at Marathon, which had given the Greek world art and music and drama, was starving to death. Throughout the winter of 405, the Athenians struggled to survive, but everyone knew the end was nigh. Only how would the Spartans treat them? As Xenophon writes, they could see no future for themselves except to suffer what they had made others suffer. People of small states whom they had injured not in retaliation for anything they had done, but out of the arrogance of power. Athens had made the argument for might makes right, and Sparta was now going to enforce it. In March of 404, the Athenians surrendered unconditionally. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War. And before we get into that, Alcibiades saw that it was once again time to save his bacon, and off to Phrygia he went, in central Anatolia, to seek favor with the Persians. Except the Spartans had already tipped off Artaxerxes about this and asked him to deal with it. Stopping at an inn for the night, Alcibiades was in bed with his mistress when he awoke to his room in flames. With no way out but the window, he wrapped a nightshirt around his arm for a shield, grabbed a sword, and leapt through the fire, only to be cut down by Persian arrows outside. Now back in Athens, the Spartans had seized the city and had every right to destroy it and do to the Athenians what they had done to Melos. But they didn't. Even as Corinth and Thebes pushed for Athens' destruction, the Spartans allowed the Athenians to continue existing, declaring that the city had done good service in the time of greatest danger to Greece. Well, it's downright noble of them. That said, the long walls were torn down, the army was disbanded, the city was allowed 12 triremes for commercial use only, and the port of Piraeus was now free. In short, Athens was a client state of Sparta. But wait, there's more. The democracy which created this war wasn't coming back, nor was the drinking club oligarchy that had taken over. Instead, the city was turned over to 30 hard-nosed aristocrats, led by a man named Critias, who, just like Alcibiades, happened to be a former student of Socrates. Backed by the full might of the Spartan army, the 30 launched a campaign of terror to root out, arrest, and execute all democratic leaders and those with democratic sympathies. Critias and the others come up with a list of about 3,000 citizens who need to be shown democracy doesn't work. Every time they arrested and executed one, they would also seize their property. Gotta pay the bills, you know. Although 3,000 is an awful lot to get through, and to make the job go faster, they rounded up regular citizens and forced them to venture out and make arrests themselves. One night, it was Socrates' turn to find one Leon of Salamis by name. The philosopher must have been in a moral quandary. On one hand, he got a government he sort of wanted, one where important decisions weren't made by uneducated dimwits, but by the best and the brightest, who also happened to be scary bloodthirsty. And now he needed to rat out someone for execution? Remember, his inner voice only told him what was wrong, not what was right. And this was really wrong. And so Socrates did the only thing he could do. He went home. Now luckily for Socrates, because he could have been killed for doing that, the 30 had made way too many powerful enemies, and right around this time they were overthrown and Critias was killed. When the uprising had settled, all Athenians from all walks of life made peace with each other, and with Sparta's permission, the democracy was restored. The Spartans figured as long as Athenian power was still hobbled, they could have whatever government they wanted, provided they obeyed one new rule: political amnesty. By law, no one could be prosecuted for any political crime of the past few years. We're gonna let bygones be bygones. It's the only way to move forward. Athens agrees to the law. But now the city has a new problem. Sure, the war was over and democracy was back, but without an empire to manage, Athenian citizens found themselves with a lot of downtime. And in that downtime came a lot of thinking, like, what the heck got us in this mess? Everything was fine when we had a democracy. I mean, yeah, Sparta conquered the city, but only because those lousy rich boy oligarchy clubs made us weak. Yeah! And who was at the forefront telling them democracy doesn't work? Oh, that's right, Socrates. Here's the thing. The amnesty law protected Socrates from what people really wanted to get him for. Teaching a way of life that produced both Alcibiades and Critias, so they had to get creative. And in 399, at the age of 70, Socrates was put on trial not for anything political, but for not believing in the gods of the city, introducing new gods, and corrupting the youth. Witnesses took the stand to describe how Socrates had ruined their children, turning them from hard-working teenagers into lazy adults, spending all their time thinking instead of doing real work. Socrates argued that he had freed their minds, but their parents weren't buying it. And as angry as they were with him, the real crime Socrates was being charged with was impiety. People testified that Socrates refused to acknowledge the sun and moon as gods, and that voice he speaks to, this daemonion, why it's nothing more than a false god looking to corrupt this good city. The evidence was mounting against him, weak as it was. The prosecution was asking for death, yet when it was his time to speak, Socrates gave a curious response. Only 2 copies of his defense exist, and while both are second-hand accounts, both portray the same defiant man giving a weak and downright aggravating response. Know that if you kill me, you will not injure me so much as yourselves, for I believe it is not the gods' will that a better man be injured by a worse. If you put me to death, you will not easily find another, who attaches himself to a city as a gadfly to a horse, which, though large and well-bred, is sluggish on account of his size and needs to be aroused by stinging. You're nothing without me, Athens. Surprisingly, despite his tone, the mood of the jury was almost split down the middle over what to do with him. Now, Athenian law had an interesting little caveat. If you're accused of a crime and await the death penalty, you could propose an alternative sentence and allow the jury to decide. Neat, right? Maybe house arrest or probation. His supporters certainly felt exile would work just fine. Nope, Socrates tells the jury that they should award him an annual stipend and free meals for life based on his service to the city. And just like that, he managed to offend those who were on the fence about him, and he's sentenced to death. Shortly after, he's sent off to an Athenian jail to be joined by his friends and supporters as they watch him drink hemlock, the preferred method of execution in Athens. Hemlock goes right to work on the central nervous system, leading to muscular paralysis, especially in the lungs. Almost immediately after drinking the poison, Socrates felt his feet go numb as he was laid down gently on his bed. From there, the numbness spread up his body, and his breathing became shallower. But before the poison had completely taken him, Socrates turned to one of his companions and said, "Crito, I owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please remember to pay that debt." His friend Crito agrees and asks if there's anything else to say. But it's too late. Socrates was no more. Of course, when your last words are that vague and mysterious, you know that's going to lead to all sorts of crazy ideas, right? Asclepius was the god of healing, so why would Socrates give a rooster a chicken as payment? As Xenophon suggested, Socrates was already sick when he went on trial, and welcomed the hemlock as a release from his pain. It would certainly explain why he put up such a poor defense. Then again, Socrates was also seen as making a stand against the hypocrisy of Athenian democracy, as a sort of martyr. If the government was as good and noble as they thought it was, then how on earth could you sentence a 70-year-old man to death for teaching? But it didn't matter anymore. The city had taken revenge on a perceived enemy of the state, and created a climate inhospitable for his followers, especially a young, broad-shouldered man who deeply mourned his teacher's death. Next time on the podcast History of Our World, we'll take a look at this student of Socrates as he attempts to put his mentor's words on paper. Socrates wrote nothing down on his own, so it's up to our new broad-shouldered friend to fix it. Along the way, he'll acquire his own followers, start a school, and attract one student who seemed more scientist than philosopher. It's going to be an episode like we haven't done in a while, without any wars or violence. I can't remember the last time we've done that.